Well, welcome everyone. It's good to have you join us for this workshop. My name is Rich Janzen, and I'm here with my colleagues, David Kurfurst, Leah Hamilton, and Nabiha Atallah. And we are having a workshop today on making evaluation meaningful. And our subtitle is Building Capacity for Community-Based Evaluation in Times of Disruption. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm on the territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples who continue to have an unresolved interest in the lands within 6 miles of the Grand River and an area that includes our location at the University of Waterloo, and that we continue to work for justice and reconciliation. Here's the purpose of our workshop. It's to explore how service provider organizations can build their internal community-based evaluation capacity, and to build that in ways that make evaluation meaningful to them, including in times of disruption. So 2 parts to that, more generally around evaluation capacity building that uses a community-based approach, and then also with the angle of the disruption caused by the pandemic. Here's our plan for the workshop. I'll start off with an overview of community-based evaluation and specifically for disruptive times. And then David Kurfurst from IRCC will talk about what's the role of government to support service provider organizations. Before Leah Hamilton comes and talks about how academics and outside consultants can support community-based organizations. And then the real kicker will be Nabiha from a community-based, from a service provider organization, talking about ISANS as an example and illustration of how to build a culture of evaluation. We'll have all of these 4 presentations first, and then we'll have a Q&A towards the end. But we invite you to use your Q&A box to keep asking us questions throughout, but we will be answering them towards the end. So let's start with an overview of community-based evaluation. And I just want to locate myself. I work for an organization called the Center for Community-Based Research. We're on the University of Waterloo campus. Been around for almost 40 years now, do work in different societal issues, but many of our projects center around newcomers and refugee newcomers. And this presentation, this workshop, comes out of a national project that all 4 of us have been working on, called the Evaluating Refugees Programs. So this is an SDI, Service Delivery Improvement Programs, and today is the last day of this project. This is the last activity that we have. It's actually yesterday was the end of the project officially, March 31st. And this was a national capacity building initiative. How can we build the capacity of those groups, those organizations and networks, any type of group who is supporting refugee newcomers? How can we build their capacity in doing a community-based approach to evaluation? So let's start with what is evaluation, and here's one definition. There's different definitions out there, but one definition is that evaluation is an approach to gathering information about the activities and about the impacts or outcomes of that program that assess the accomplishments and effectiveness of a program, or it could be of an organization or even of a community initiative, and helps to improve it. There's many drivers of evaluation, why we do evaluation in our organizations. Sometimes we do it reactively in response to the accountability that our funders require of us. And sometimes it's more proactive, where we think about evaluation as being helpful or useful for organizational development, or even for helping us to be more adaptive and responding to shifting contexts, in even contexts like the disruption that happened during the pandemic. And so when we talk about making evaluation meaningful, we're talking about not only doing the evaluation for whatever motivation that you have, but also using the evaluation results, a real utilization focus to the evaluation that sees the evaluation as actually being of utility for an organization. And we can do evaluation in disruptive times, or maybe we need to do evaluation all the more in disruptive times when things are not as they always have been. And some of the reasons why we would want to do that is for strategic learning. Your organization is still your organization with its strategic directions, even in spite of disruption that comes along. And so evaluation can help to focus on those strategic directions. Can also provide opportunity for reflective practice, whether that's formally or informally, that as a disruption comes along, we need to think before we plan and before we act. We can also use evaluation for adaptive management. We can think about evaluation in terms of real-time evidence. We have to make decisions within organizations. Managers need to make evidence-based decisions. And so evaluation can help to provide that real-time evidence. And it's also useful in stimulating innovation. Times of disruption, as we know, are the grounds for potential innovation to happen, and evaluation can be that which helps us to stimulate that innovation. And so when we think about making evaluation meaningful in disruptive times, we think about how evaluation can help us as organizations to adapt to our current context that has shifted. And at the same time, also keep us focused on what our strategic mission has always been. So here's some ways that I've noticed that people are adapting during COVID times through the different evaluation projects that we've been involved in over the past year. Sometimes people adapt by changing the focus of their evaluation. Many of our projects have added research questions around how they deliver their services, their activities in new ways, how they need to deliver, what's working, what's not working well in terms of activity delivery. But also, maybe we need some differences in outcomes that we are intending, that we're aiming for. And so if you have activities and outcomes, you really got a theory of change, right? And so in one way that we've been seeing people adapt their evaluations is on testing their new theories of change within the new disruptive context of the pandemic. But beyond the evaluation focus, we can also change how or adapt how we do the evaluation, how we implement it, and how we gather information. For example, how do we deal with multilingual data gathering that's remote? It's hard enough when it's face-to-face, but what are the technological challenges of doing that multilingual translation or interpretation remotely? And what are some of the ethical considerations that are different of doing remote evaluation? How do we obtain informed consent in a real way? How do we deal with the digital access and literacy barriers that some people may have in participating in our evaluations? And finally, another way of adaptability has been around evaluation use, how people, organizations use the evaluation, both in terms of how they communicate their findings remotely, how do you do knowledge mobilization, and also how to clarify what program adaptations can be carried forward beyond the pandemic. In one of our evaluations with a refugee program, they realized that the adaptation to a remote learning platform should be carried forward. It's no longer a plan B to do remote training, but this is now, because of their evaluation, they learned that this is a way that they will, even post-pandemic, deliver their activities. The main message of our workshop is this, that a community-based approach to evaluation will help evaluation to be meaningful, even and maybe especially in disruptive and uncertain times. So that's the main point throughout our 4 presentations that we'll be hammering on. And it begs the question of what is a community-based approach. So I'll just take a couple of minutes to review that and to talk about the distinctiveness of a community-based approach to evaluation that may be different from other approaches to evaluation. And it's centered around our formula of 3-3-4-11, starting with the 3 hallmarks of community-based evaluation. It's evaluation that strives, it tries to be as much as possible to be stakeholder driven, asking who has a stake in this program, this organization that we're evaluating, and how can our unique theory of change be that which drives the evaluation. That it's participatory. It says, how can those stakeholders be meaningfully involved throughout the evaluation process, from beginning to the end, and the end being the usefulness or the use of the evaluation results. And finally, that it's action-oriented. Yes, it is about curiosity, about learning, but it's more than just learning. It's about using that information to change practice. We can also talk about community-based research in terms of the 3 goals or the functions that it has. That it is about learning together, it's research. So we ask questions, get answers, and summarize them. But it's also about sharing those results, being smart in how we share those results to the audiences who need to hear those results, maybe in different ways, maybe in creative ways. But it's also about engaging people. The process of evaluation itself is an intervention of building stronger relationships amongst those stakeholders so that they are equipped to do and use the evaluation results. I'll just skip along here to also talk about the 4 phases of community-based evaluation: laying the foundation, evaluation planning, gathering information and analyzing that information, and then acting on findings and using the evaluation results. So you see kind of 2 extra phases in traditional evaluation: in the laying the foundation, being relationally based, negotiating really what the purpose of the evaluation is. And then also at the end, the acting on the findings. The evaluation isn't done until the evaluation team helps to facilitate the uptake of those results. You can also see that feedback loop between phase 2 and 3, that sometimes in community settings, things are a bit unpredictable. And COVID was a great example that we've had to, in a number of our evaluations, go back and say, okay, now how exactly are we going to deliver this evaluation? How are we going to ask questions? In what format? So there may be some changes that needs to be had. And then also the last thing I just want to point out on this chart is that arrow from phase 4 to phase 1, that you can think about evaluation in cycles. And I think Nabiha is going to be referring to that one evaluation cycle, whatever that is, 8 months, 1 year, 2 years, doesn't have to do everything. That you can think, you can bite off the size of the evaluation that's as big as you're able to handle, and think that you can do multiple cycles of evaluation. So in general, you can think about evaluation having 2 approaches: an expert-based or a community-based approach. And our workshop is focusing on the community-based approach, an approach that keeps you in the driver's seat, even if you, being service provider organizations, in the driver's seat, even if you are using outside external consultants, even if you're responding and reacting to the accountability of funder. And so in summary of a community-based approach, here's a definition for those of you who like definitions. In one sentence, you could say a community-based approach is an approach that involves the active participation of stakeholders, those whose lives are affected by the issue being studied, in all phases of the research for the purpose of producing useful results to make positive changes. Well, you might say, well, that sounds all good, but how do we do it? In fact, we don't maybe exactly have the capacity to do evaluation in that kind of way. And this is where David and Leah will speak into that. As we think about capacity at 3 different levels, yes, there is the individual capacity that we as individuals need to know a little bit about how to do evaluation. But there's also that organizational evaluation capacity, and that's what Nabiha is going to be talking about, how to build that culture of evaluation. Leah will focus more on, if you don't have the individual capacity within your organization, outside consultants or academics can be of help to you. But we also need that culture of evaluation that's supported within our organizations. And we need the enabling environment. And this is where David will kick in to talk about how government can be supporting in enabling that environment for evaluation. And in terms of the first two levels there, if you are looking for evaluation support through this Eval for Refugee website that we and our project developed, you can see all sorts of resources that are available, from introductory videos to readiness assessments to workshops and live event webinars. There's a community of practice, there's mentors that you can approach in your community. So there's a range of supports that are available to build your capacity. And you're always welcome to contact us at the Center for Community-Based Research for evaluation support if you'd like. So I was a setup guy for the other next three presentations. So I'm going to turn it over to David now, and you can talk about how federal initiatives can support service provider organizations in their community-based evaluation.
Great. Hello, everybody. My name is Dave Kurfurst. I'm the Director of Evaluation and Performance Measurement at IRCC, Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, and been in that role for quite a while. Our function is the one that assesses, as Rich alluded to earlier, the effectiveness and performance and outcomes of all of our immigration programming, and as well as working with our colleagues in the department and outside sometimes to develop metrics and approaches and capacity in evaluation and results reporting. So we're coming at this from a federal government perspective, and I wanted to start by giving you some of that context within which we're operating, which is quite similar to what Rich has described as far as evaluation goes. I think it's pretty obvious here that the emphasis in the federal government on outcomes and results has really been a priority in the last several years. You hear terms like results-based management, impacts, all these things. That emphasis hasn't gone away, and in fact is more at the forefront of what we do in the federal government these days, is really understanding the effects our programs are having on newcomers, on their lives, on their ability to integrate into Canada and so forth. And this goes all the way up to the very senior parliamentary levels. Evidence is really at the crux of what we're trying to do when we put forward policy decisions and new programs and so on. How do we add some capacity out there in the community and really get us closer in terms of aligning what evaluation can be? One of the places to start is looking at settlement and resettlement program logic models. And I'm talking about the IRCC version of these. And again, coming at this from the federal government lens, understanding that it is a starting point. Some of you might be familiar with this. These are open, transparent, shareable documents. Many times they've been distributed to the settlement community, for example, a National Settlement Council, and so on, available upon request, of course. So having a handle on what IRCC considers its outcomes and expected results for its settlement and resettlement programming is a great foundational point when you start to consider bringing that back to your world or your interventions, pilots, programs, big and small. Can you see yourself in the logic model and IRCC's outcomes and how we understand what we're trying to achieve collectively? But they are not the be all end all. These outcomes, as they're articulated, the logic models are a tool for us. We have federal government requirements. We have our own taskmasters and funders, so to speak, to answer to, but they can be layered on, they can be adapted. But the closer we are in kind of nesting outcomes out there in the settlement, integration, new resettlement communities with what the federal government thinking is, goes a long way, again, to helping you with proposals, CFP work, reporting, and understanding really what we're looking for at times can be very useful. So again, seeing yourself there. Where we need to focus, we have to move from just thinking about outputs and counting numbers and those level of results to impacts, as Rich talked about, outcomes. What difference are our programs making, big and small, at the federal government level, municipal, regional level, SPO level, service provider level, right down to understanding changes in client behavior, ability to integrate, information provided, you name it. There's quite a series of outcomes that you're trying to affect and have an impact on, and it's talking about those, as well as looking for areas of what's working well and not working so well, areas for improvement where programs can be course corrected or something can be scaled up to a broader level or across regions, across programs. Sharing best practices with other organizations is never a bad thing to do either. So it's something that you're learning through evaluative practices applicable to other areas or other people that you're connected with. And of course, just keeping in the back of our minds collectively, can you use evaluation work, performance measurement reporting to also feed another need? It might be more formalized reporting to a funder like IRCC or a provincial level or others. It can have dual purposes or multiple uses, of course, there. So just bearing that in mind. I would be remiss if, as a career evaluator, I didn't mention key principles to really keep in mind in this setting or in any setting. Objective assessments, and Leah will talk a little bit about engaging people to help you with that. But to the extent possible, objective evidence, arm's length, neutral evaluations are what we're striving for, and you can get there many different ways. But the more primary evidence and data collection that can be brought to bear, the stronger the result story is, the stronger the business cases that can be made. It has to demonstrate some degree of neutrality there, that you are having another set of eyes looking at how things have performed, how the clients have done in that semi-independent or fully independent way. And that goes a long way to substantiating those results. Robust approaches, of course, and reliable data are tied into that. There is, of course, pretty foundational ways to approach evaluation, data collection methods, key informant interviews, focus groups, surveys, qualitative and quantitative approaches really are standard, and there are different mix and match ways you can use those, and they're all perfectly valid and have different pros and cons. And looking at reliable data, be it primary data collection, as I mentioned, something you might be doing on your own or contract somebody to do. A lot of good administrative data sources are available out there, and I'll hit on that in a second at the end. So folding that into the work as well, so that it bundles up, you triangulate, you see where things converge, you can make some definitive findings, you can identify areas to improve, sometimes recommendations, and so on. So those are foundational elements. That's what we think about all the time in IRCC evaluation, and I encourage people to keep those lenses when they're going forward with their work. Now, spending a little time in terms of supporting folks in the COVID context and evaluating in such a setting, wanted to share some lessons from our end, and we're experiencing a lot of the same things. I really like, Rich, your slide about disruptive times. A lot of what you said, jives with me, of course, and we've talked. It's no accident that we are aligned here. Fairly standard challenges we're all facing, but in these times, I'm just going to double down on the crucial importance of evidence, outcomes information, regular performance monitoring and reporting. Times might be changing in terms of client reach and interaction and how we deliver our services, but the need for results does not change. It's just a matter of framing what the current context is, but evidence remains center to any story you're trying to tell against what you're delivering, be it optimal conditions or pandemic conditions. So I just have to underline that. Right now, we consider the COVID situation in the department almost like a baselining moment. Programs are going to be changed as a result of the pandemic, IRCC, surely for you folks as well. How do we understand how things are performing, what outcomes we're achieving now in this year and a bit so far, more to come, no doubt. What do things look like now? Can we kind of benchmark against this as we go forward and then talk about, I hate to use the cliche, new normal? Same applies to your results world. Things are not going to be the same, but we still have an outcome story to tell. So how do we mark that against a certain point in time? Well, now is a baselining moment, and using the last year's information and improvements and challenges is a marker to jump off from there. Rich also hit on this, and I'm going to repeat it. I think adjustments need to be made in how evaluation is conducted. And I want to reassure people that we're experiencing the same thing at IRCC. So, every level there are tweaks that have to be made with respect to methodologies, of course, and in scope. There might just simply be things that cannot be assessed in the current times for numerous reasons. Certain outcomes that we cannot reasonably expect any of us to be able to talk about at this time. Traction for evaluation will slow down. You're not going to be able to reach key informants. You're not going to be able to reach clients with the same ease and conduct some of those nice qualitative approaches. Getting together for a focus group, well, that's virtual now and not as easy to do interpretation. All things, Rich talked about, we're feeling the same pain at IRCC. So understanding that is the first step, and then tweaking those methodologies to accommodate where you can, and talk about what is possible now with respect to outcomes. And what important part of that I will raise is expectations. So talk to your management teams, your funders, your partners, your collaborators, that this is what I can expect to deliver with my outcomes work and my reporting, my data. This is what we cannot really get our arms around right now. So right from the get-go, understanding what can and cannot be delivered, or what stories can't be told, helps set you up so that gap is not too big, and then you can build off of that. And it's kind of an iterative exercise. Performance measurement, evaluation, it's iterative. I think it's got to grow from where you are right now. So setting those expectations up front is pretty key. Communicating goes without saying. No such thing as over communicating in a time of pandemic when we're all distanced, socially, professionally, we're not in the same spaces. So can't hurt to just really blast those messages out there and stay in touch on big things and little things, methodologically speaking, project timing wise, all of those things goes a long way. Those principles I mentioned still hold here. Acknowledging compromises will have to be made, but perhaps not at the cost of the rigor that we want to bring to our evidence and to our understanding of outcomes here. You might be able to broaden your risk tolerance a little bit. Can we live with less lines of evidence? Can we have a smaller sample for our survey? Those things definitely feasible and still make sense, but using the same tools, putting the same kind of strength and rigorous approach there, robustness, can't lose sight of those as we go forward. When it comes to reporting in these conditions, we've got to be transparent and shouldn't hide behind issues that we're all facing right now in different ways, and citing gaps. As I said earlier, this is how we know things have affected our programs and our clients. Here's what we don't know, and here's where some of our data gaps are, and maybe thinking about mitigating strategies or go forward plans, and just really being upfront about that. And I've done this in my evaluation world right up to our senior management, and saying you can't expect this or that from us in the current year because it's just not possible to report on it, but we're going to build it into our future practices. I think we've already talked a little bit about virtual data collection and so forth, but that is the way right now, using Teams, Zoom, WhatsApp, and there's many tools I'm not even familiar with, but we're connecting with folks virtually, remotely. We're elongating our timelines for our projects, and I would tell people it's all right to have some slippage in what you expected to do 6 months ago, 8 months ago. Looking forward to that, but just trying to manage around it. And also, we're leaning more heavily into administrative and existing data sources here because it is very powerful and it does tell us something, and it is a bit of a marker right now, as like I said, as a baseline to go forward from here. And I pause here to give you some examples, and they're not listed in the slide, but you think about data sources, and I saw a question pop up already about this, but Statistics Canada is your friend, folks, and I think more than ever, you can drill down and census data, or you go to the Government of Canada open data portal. I hope people are familiar with this. Immigration Canada is, I believe, the most frequent or highest volume of information posted on the Government of Canada open data portal for immigration. So you can get all sorts of subsets and slice and dice this. All the resources Rich mentioned that his organization, hugely rich there, no pun intended. The CCH, Canadian Community Health Survey, it's a powerful one. And there's others there that I'd be happy to talk about offline. And I'll make a small plug to my colleagues in the department. We have recently established a chief data office who manage data requests. So I'd be happy to send out some information on how to contact them with specific parameters listed. They can take a bit of time and do very tailored data requests to low levels based on eye care information. Some folks might know our settlement services system called iCare. They can slice and dice some of the open data portal stuff in new ways. Census data, we have good, strong connection with StatCan. So just kind of hammering that there is a wealth of information that doesn't involve trying to reach clients that you can use there as well. So just rounding off, I think I've given you a sense of some of IRCC's approaches and challenges. And part of building the capacity in the community and enabling stronger evaluation is kind of closing that gap in our understanding. So I hope what I've given you gives a bit of a reassurance, that you likely on the right track. You could see the alignment between Rich's discussion and mine, and it's really closing those areas where you're not sure what constitutes solid evaluation work, or understanding there are different ways to get at it. And those are all perfectly acceptable. I think if you stick to a few key ideas and methodology, how you do it, Leah's going to go through some ways to engage our community-based Nabiha there. We'll talk to you. And I think it'll tie together nicely. So I hope you're gleaning something for that and get a bit of, like I said, comfort that we're sharing some of these experiences with you at the federal government level. But, evaluation remains super valuable. And I think we're moving in the right direction together, and urge you to reach out to me anytime as well from a federal government lens. If you'd like to chat, I'd be happy to engage. So if I could pass it over, Rich, I think that's it for me at the time being until questions.
Thanks so much, David. I'm up next. My name is Leah Hamilton. I'm a professor at the Bissett School of Business at Mount Royal University in Calgary, and soon will also be cross-appointed to the psychology department, which I'm excited about. And I identify as a community-engaged migration scholar. So I'm located here in Treaty 7 region in Southern Alberta, which is the traditional territories of the Niitsitapi Blackfoot, and includes the Siksika, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about partnering with academics to conduct evaluations and some of the potential that exists when immigrant serving agencies partner with academics or external consultants when doing their evaluations. And I guess I'll start by just saying I really think different groups can speak to each other, and we really understand each other. And I think that's kind of illustrated here at this table today, where the four of us have worked together and presented together in various capacities. And I think the best place to grow and improve is when we're all at the table. So even if you have the capacity internally that Rich talked about earlier, might there be value in it also including a third party from outside your organization? David talked about the settlement and resettlement program logic models being a good starting point, but what I heard him say was that IRCC is really looking for you to adapt and tailor those models to your own organization, which Nabiha will talk about a little bit later. So as far as what the value is of partnering with someone who's at arm's length from your organization, I think funders like IRCC in particular do really like third-party evaluation. So you heard David mention things like objective assessments and robust approaches and reliable data as these three key principles. And I remember doing a project once as sort of an external person looking at outcomes, and how the executive director of the organization would always kind of joke around about how much IRCC seemed to like that third-party arm's length evaluation, and how it was already seen as more objective somehow, or as a way to triangulate the data and the outcomes that your organization already collects. David sort of also talked about independent eyes or neutrality. And so I think one thing to think about is, what do you already know? What data are you already gathering? And then how might you triangulate that in some way? I think this notion of objectivity even comes into play, for instance, if I'm conducting focus groups for an immigrant serving agency, for instance, and no one from the agency is present. So the individuals who conducted the programs aren't there. I do think the clients are really honest. They feel this sense of safety. They feel more anonymous because they are. And so I do think you get different types of information. What else did I want to mention? So I think in the most recent call for service delivery improvement applications, there was this question asked around who's going to evaluate the project's performance. And if it's going to be a third party, please provide some information about that third party. And for me, I see this as the funder, in this case, IRCC, not saying you have to conduct a third-party evaluation, but the language is there. The signal's being sent that some organizations are doing this. But I think if you want to work with a third-party evaluator or community-based researcher, it shouldn't just be about value for the funder. Okay, and I think David would be the first person to agree with this, and Nabiha too, and Rich, but also around organizational learning. So this isn't about audit. This isn't about box ticking or funder expectations. This isn't about doing an evaluation to you or on you. It's about doing an evaluation for you. And yeah, I think, you know, this idea of a proactive evaluation, if you partner with someone who's truly community engaged and ethical, you can deeply learn about things that are happening at your organization and come from this place of growth. So the next thing I wanted to mention was just how there can be mutual benefits to partnering with academics. So Rich talked about this notion of the collective and drawing on the expertise of the collective. And I really love that. People have different passions. And I think something amazing can happen when you combine an organization's deep insight into their programs with an academic's or third-party evaluator's curiosity and theoretical expertise and interest and passion for evaluation. You know, we all show up with slightly different skill sets and competencies and interests, but I think there are these exponential gains when we co-create things. Even things like this move to collecting data virtually. This might be new to your organization, but some of us may have been working in this space for years. And so this way, again, you're leveraging your internal capacity with the expertise from someone outside to learn and grow in new ways. Other sort of more tangible sort of strategic or mutual benefits are to pool resources in innovative ways. So for instance, when you look at certain funding pools, they actually they require nonprofits to partner with academics. So they exist strictly for things like making decisions and collecting evidence for your organization. I'm thinking here of the SSHRC Partnership Engage grants. They explicitly say they're to fund a decision that helps the partner organization, and academics need to apply for those. And they lend themselves really beautifully to an evaluation project. And there were even some of these grants that had a COVID focus. So those are great for looking at how the pandemic impacted your service delivery and intended outcomes, for instance. Other ways are things like partnering with a senior capstone class at a university, graduate students, or even honor students. They're really nice ways to build bridges with universities and to kind of mentor the next generation. They're great ways to recruit new talent into your organization, recognizing that the professor would be the one who leads that evaluation. And obviously we don't need to be paid. That's part of what we do, part of our job. Okay. So with all that in mind, how do you sort of find someone who will take an inclusive community-based approach to evaluation? I think when we think back to the title of this workshop, it was making evaluation meaningful. And I think there's a lot that's sort of baked into that. So what is going to be meaningful for your organization? And who can you work with that will make that evaluation meaningful for you? And the first question to ask is really around shared values. And this is about having an open conversation. Look at the type of work that the person does. Look at the organizations they've partnered with. Assess this sort of values fit. Is this a consultant who's never worked in this space and is it just in it for the paycheck? Or is this someone that you trust? You know, I think about that expression, nothing about us without us, or nothing for us without us, I think is really important here. You don't want people who show up with an idea of the project they want to conduct because it's about executing their program of research. No, this is about co-creating something that's going to be meaningful for your organization. And there's a really nice checklist on the CCBR website that can help you assess some of these things like shared values fit. The other question is around sort of the rigor of the research. So is the research relevant for you? Is it rigorous and is it sound? So does this person have the expertise? You know, David talked about quantitative and qualitative approaches. So again, what is the question that, or questions that you want to answer? And does the person have the expertise to do this? I like to think that there is an extra layer of protection built in for the most vulnerable people here, which are the clients, because especially for academics in universities, we have to get ethics approval. And that means there is this body that has looked at this evaluation plan and said, no, that's good. You have protected the confidentiality and anonymity of the clients in this case. And there's also, I know CCBR also has an ethics tool that they use for community-based projects. So that can also be really helpful there. And then the last thing I want to talk about is knowledge mobilization. So I think right when you start co-creating this project or this evaluation framework with someone, you should already be thinking about how are we going to mobilize the knowledge? How are we going to move those findings into action? And I do think there is a role for the evaluator or the researcher, the third party, to help move those findings into action so that those reports or findings don't just sit on a shelf. And Rich did talk about this notion of remote knowledge mobilization, which to some extent we're doing today. But what does the future of that look like? And once those outcomes or that evaluation is done, what is the future of that partnership going to look like between that third party and the organization? And I think those conversations are really useful to have up front. That's all I wanted to talk about. I'm happy to take questions later, but now I'm going to turn things over to Nabiha.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nabiha Atallah. I'm with ISANS, Immigrant Services Association of Nova Scotia. So I'm speaking to you from the unceded traditional territories of the Mi'kmaq, and we at ISANS are grateful for the peace and friendship treaties. My role at ISANS is advisor on strategic initiatives. So that includes the areas of policy, research, evaluation, among others. And our journey to building our culture of evaluation started through the project that Rich mentioned with the CCBR of building capacity to evaluate refugee programs. Through this participation in the project, we decided that we wanted to build our evaluation capacity. And I'm going to walk you through the steps we've taken, are still taking, because it's definitely a work in progress. So we participated, we had a large number of our leadership team participate in a workshop as part of the project Rich mentioned. And we agreed that the community-based approach that was presented there was clear and aligns with our values. So we had a large number of our leadership team on board in committing to taking on a community-based approach and building our evaluation capacity. I'm going to add a little bit here in response to the things that Dave and Leah said, because as a service providing organization, even if in some situations we use an external evaluator, even in order to do that, we need to first, or at the same time, be building our own evaluation capacity so that we understand the role of that external evaluator so that we can collaborate with them most effectively, and to build our own capacity by learning, to be open to learning from them how we can change the way we do things to improve our evaluation approach. So one of the most helpful things that got us going was the realization that rather than trying to build a whole framework and then start evaluating, we could choose to begin a parallel process. And in discussions with CCBR, we decided to do this, to have a plan to build a framework for the whole organization's approach to evaluation, but not to wait till that was done, to start evaluating at the same time and learn from both directions. So we selected at that time an IRCC SDI project, which had an evaluation requirement. And we decided this would be the first project we would try to deliberately learn from. And we created two parallel internal committees. We created an advisory committee to oversee the whole framework development. So this is a standing committee, and I'll show you in a minute who's involved in that. And we created a specific steering committee for the first pilot project. So here you see the two committees and how they work together. The Framework Advisory Working Group includes our CEO, myself, our two program directors, the manager of online, not specifically because of the online team, but because this person was a manager with a lot of experience in evaluation and in data management, and 2 to 3 experienced staff members at large. The selection of those staff was through an application process. We put out the call explaining the role of the people on this advisory working group and asking for people with some experience in research and evaluation to apply to be a part of this working group. And we have 3 people from different teams across the organization who had previous experience in research and evaluation and are so they are bringing skills to this working group. We also have consulted CCBR on an ongoing basis. And then you see that we have the Pilot Project Steering Committee. This, for each project, we would create a new steering committee. So we determined that the general principle for creating a steering committee for each project would be to include a staff member, clients, and partners, as well as that program's manager and myself and the program director to provide overlap with the Framework Advisory Group. So the idea here is that while the Pilot Project Steering Committee is overseeing that specific evaluation, there is also feedback going to the working group, the advisory working group. So it's a process of taking the lessons learned from a specific evaluation and incorporating those into the bigger framework. At the same time, providing a resource for that project steering committee in the Framework Advisory Group that sets the parameters and provides resources and is there as a reference and resource group. So that's the general design. So we began this process toward the end, the fall of 2019. We had some meetings of our Framework Advisory Working Group and decided that we would aim to develop a framework and a multi-year plan. We'd work on an organizational logic model. As Dave mentioned, we have referred to and used the IRCC logic model for many years, and we wanted to have our own logic model that would acknowledge our funders' logic models and the specific logic models for different projects and programs in a nesting sort of format. We decided that we wanted to track what we learned from each evaluation project, develop processes to gather high-level data on a regular basis across the organization, collect and develop resources and tools, and map and strengthen the links between evaluation, outcomes measurement, reporting, program and service development. So as you can see, it's an ambitious work plan. And then COVID hit. So after a couple of months, this group meets monthly. After a couple of months to constitute this group, we started meeting and then had to hit pause while we reorganized. We had several months where we did not address this issue because of COVID. At the same time, COVID provided us with an interesting new opportunity, and there was funding available to evaluate how organizations are responding, how service providing organizations are responding to COVID. So we applied for this funding through the Child and Youth Refugee Research Coalition and decided that our project for the year 2020 would be to evaluate as well as the SDI project, which we had started and was proceeding and wrapping up early in 2020, we took on another project to evaluate our response to COVID as an organization. And that has been very interesting. That project is almost done now. We hope to have it wrapping up in the next month or two. So we repeated that process of creating a steering committee for our COVID evaluation. And we wrapped up the first evaluation for the SDI project. And the steering committee in each case is responsible for implementing the steps of the community-based approach. For the project of our COVID response evaluation, we were so focused on managing our work through COVID, and the funding was available. So we were able to work with Howard Ramos at Western University to have him and a student as our external evaluators for this project, working closely with our project steering committee. So it was great to have the resources and the people to do that when all of us were very focused on how are we going to day adapt our programs, keep serving our clients, keep the organization going, support our staff. This was a case where having an external evaluator was so wonderful. And as Leah mentioned, especially when that evaluator shares your values, appreciates and understands the challenges of being an SPO. And we have found that that's definitely the case. So this has been a really positive experience for us. We have had increased capacity through the funding available for that project, and that's not always available. So that's an issue in using an external evaluator, is having the financial resources to pay where it's the case is needed to have that partnership. And as an SPO, we often don't have that option. So we are really working on two tracks here of building our own capacity to evaluate on an ongoing basis and using external evaluators when that's a possibility for us. And hopefully learning from both those experiences to enhance the other. So it's not an either or in our case. We are doing both at the same time in different ways. The advantages we are finding with this approach of building the framework while doing evaluations is that because it's an incremental or iterative process, it's manageable for us. I think that one thing that kept us from doing this before was that a lot of us thought we have to create a framework, we have to train our staff, we have to be ready, and then we start doing our evaluations. Well, I'm not sure when we would have gotten to that. It's very hard to stop and create that capacity first. And so this building as we go is working well for us. It's also a flexible approach. It's been a flexible approach from the beginning. And that means as other opportunities come up, we can incorporate them. So this year, our regional umbrella organization known as IRCC offered a training, a professional development online program in evaluation, which about a dozen of our colleagues have been able to participate in. So that's another track where we have a group of ISANS staff, again, from across the organization being trained in evaluation, and we are in communication with them and incorporating what they learn into this general approach. also the fact that we engage staff on the steering committees for each project is a learning opportunity. And we are deliberately picking projects from different teams so that we are cycling, as Rich was saying, doing projects in different aspects of our work and expanding the capacity that way so that there will be experience on each team. And again, in every, it's not a one size fits all even within our organization. For some projects, we feel it's really valuable to have an external evaluation. For others, we feel that this is a great opportunity for us to set up the evaluation and learn through it. And both of those streams require capacity in a different way, and a different kind of capacity. So we're building our capacity to work with external evaluators, and in some cases to access funding for that, which is something that takes capacity to find and apply for funding. At the same time, we're building our capacity to do our own evaluations to get better at collecting and understanding and using our data so that we can do really solid evidence-based evaluations internally as well. And finally, to circle back to disruptive times, we have spent, as most service providers have, a lot of time this year adapting our work with our clients so that we can continue serving them and meeting our outcomes. That's taken a lot of time and energy and focus from the team. And in trying to continue some evaluation through the year of COVID, we did find limits to engaging clients and partners virtually. We found more challenges, not only in terms of the platforms we might use, but in terms of people's focus and energy, people having the time and availability to participate. So we slowed everything down, recognizing that we're still continuing, our intent is the same, we're still on the same path, but we've tried to be a little more realistic in what we hope to accomplish in this year. And in fact, we spent quite a bit of time on that step of articulating our organizational logic model. It was, it took more work than we expected, than I expected anyway. But it was a very helpful process because all of us on the Framework Advisory Working Group came at it in different ways. We really built it together collaboratively, providing perspectives from different aspects of the organization. And that has provided a really good base for us to work from. So while we had to, in a sense, change our expectations this past year, we're still on the same path. We're still excited about building our capacity, building our networks for evaluation, and learning together. So thank you.
Thanks, Nabiha, and thanks, Leah and Dave as well. 4 different presentations, but all on the common topic of making evaluation meaningful. We want to move to the Q&A part, and again, encourage you to keep the questions coming in. We still have another good 15 minutes to have a conversation with the 42 of you who are online. And I'm looking at the first question, and it's directed at you, Nabiha. So as I ask it, you can start to think about what kind of response you would like. How do you see community members fully engaged in this process and on the steering committee in particular?
That's been interesting because the first project that I mentioned, the SDI, was one where we had a group of refugee clients whom we were supporting to develop small businesses that they could set up at our farmers market. And so it was a community integration project, if you will. We had the partnership with the farmers market, the context of the vendors, and we had a group of clients who, while very entrepreneurial, had some challenges with language, had some challenges with understanding the Canadian context. And so we felt it was a particularly interesting one to start with. And we were impressed by how keen our clients were to participate in the evaluation. They really wanted to give us feedback. And we were fortunate that we were able to have interpreters involved so that the interviews with the clients were done in first language. And we got a lot of information from that. We got a lot of feedback from them. We were also fortunate that the farmers market partners were willing to engage, although that took some negotiation, because the person who was most involved in our project had to explain to her boss why she was taking time to come to meetings at ISANS. And we had to write a letter to explain the role, the purpose of this evaluation, and why their role was important for a community-based evaluation. I think one of the things that we learned, we also had an established immigrant entrepreneur as a partner engaged in this evaluation. We had a sort of an idealistic plan that all the steering committee would meet together regularly. And we found that just in terms of people's time, we couldn't have this committee meeting regularly the way our internal groups do when the stakeholders were involved and the clients were involved. So we had to have a lot more flexibility. We had some meetings that were just internal and then some meetings where the partners and clients were involved. We tried to plan our meetings late afternoons so that the person from the farmers market could be there, so that clients would be available. It took a lot of creative planning and negotiation, which we hadn't anticipated. A lot more flexibility, but that was a very valuable learning from that project, that we had really keen partners, but to make it work, we had to be realistic in what we were asking of them in terms of time and their role in the evaluation. And we had to make it a lot more specific.
Great, thanks, Nabiha. Yeah, often we make a distinction between the evaluation team, the doers of the evaluation, with the steering committee, which are the guiders of the evaluation. And sometimes there is that needed extra support to support the guiders in their role. Many of them may have never played that role before, and there's those intentional supports that you talked about. We have a related question, and maybe this one, Leah, I'm going to punt it to you, is how do we balance community-based evaluation with objective arm length assessments?
Sure, it's a great question. And I'll also draw on the rest of you to answer as well, because I do think Nabiha mentioned this insofar as having folks as part of the advisory committee. And she talked about how sometimes it makes sense to have the objective arm's length evaluator, and other times it makes sense to do things internally. And I think you know your organization and your needs best. And so I certainly don't think this is an either or approach. I think it depends on the question. So we always start with, what's the question that you want to answer? Whether that is, coming from that place of growth and curiosity, and then work from there. So then where would it make sense to have a more arm's length evaluation, and where would it make sense to do things internally? But I also, again, I don't think these are discrete options. I think when you choose to do something internally, you can still bring someone onto your advisory committee that comes from outside the organization Or similarly, if the external evaluator is taking a truly community-based approach, they're never erasing your organization from the evaluation. Your organization should be centered always. And so I hope that kind of answers your question, but I'm sure that Nabiha and David and Rich can build on what I've said.
Yeah, why don't I offer a few thoughts? And I agree with Leah's points there, and there's different ways to get at that arm's length or assure you have the right lens on the evaluation. A couple of practical thoughts I'd share is knowing who that ultimate audience is, along the lines of what Leah said, and having clear lines of reporting at the outset, like who's going to get the findings in the final reporting, ensuring that there's a transparency there. I can give you an example at our end. Our evaluation group reports right to our deputy minister. So I don't report to the program owners per se. Like this is for them, but there is that arm's length that has to take place, and they understand that from the get-go. So having the right channels and so that your findings and reports and evaluation results land in the right place is a good start. You could think about the advisory community approach, and that brings fresh perspectives and a bit of sort of independence there, or a peer review process as well, an outsider who can kind of contribute that objective views along the way and give you advice and support, I think is another very practical method. And also along the lines of arm's length, I just remember that mixed methods approach and the strength of your evidence there. So when you have strong triangulated methods, mixed quantitative, qualitative use of data, becomes harder to refute the findings. So the stronger that base is, no matter what lines of evidence you use, it makes it easier to present findings without any varnish. And I think that's what you want to go for ultimately, no matter how you position it or how you get there.
Thanks, David. Yeah, certainly the rigor mantra in community-based approach is multiple methods, multiple perspectives, right? Don't put all your eggs in any one method. Because as David said, you need to triangulate, you need to construct your evidence, and the more methods and perspectives, that helps to strengthen the trustworthiness of what you are trying to find. There's another related question I'll ask before I'll loop back to the other ones, but Jasmine says, when engaging external evaluators, most of the time they're brought in at the very last stage. Some data the evaluators may not be able to collect in the early stages of the program. How do we overcome this challenge? Nabiha, based on your experience, there's an assumption here that external evaluators come at the very last stage. I think in your example, it was actually, at the beginning of the stage, right?
We're trying, yes, we're trying much more deliberately now when we start a new project to develop an evaluation plan from the beginning. And this really helps because then you're beginning with the end in mind, and everybody is on the same page and aware that this is a process we're all going to be engaged in through the project. So I would say whenever possible, it's great to start with an evaluation plan and bring anybody external in from the start. In some cases, we have brought somebody in after we started, just the way timing worked, when projects were starting and we had not yet begun this approach. And it is a bit more challenging because then there isn't a kind of a built-in agreement among all the stakeholders about the data collection as you're going along, which can be really helpful to establish from the beginning. But with a good external partner, especially someone who shares your values and respects the work you do, it's possible. Not recommended, but possible.
Great, thanks, Nabiha. Leah, I'm wondering if you want to field the question about how can we center a community-based evaluation approach to our programs when there's not a lot of data available?
Yeah, I would actually maybe kick that question to David. It seems to be more about IRCC data. If you're comfortable, David, I think you might be better positioned to answer it.
Yeah, a few thoughts for sure. Broadly speaking, I would say if you can engage on IRCC data in particular, noted there are some limitations, but I would also suggest that the depth and availability of that data has grown quite a lot in recent times and might be worth another look, or perhaps work a bit collaboratively with us at IRCC and reach out to the data officer, like I said, or I can help facilitate some connections to understand better what is being sought and how we can provide that to you, because you'd be surprised, I think, at this point, folks, just what is available from those administrative data sets right down to the census. Like, we can get down to the CMA, the Central Metropolitan Area level of information and so on. So we're getting down there quite a bit. So if we can help, let me know. It's not my area per se, but I can definitely make connections there. I would also kindly offer that where there is not that data, the primary data collection will be where you want to find yourself. Is, can you get some on the ground information and results, virtual focus groups right now, interviews, exit interviews after an intervention or a session or a workshop, can get you some really fresh, rich, deep information. And that's what part of evaluation is doing some of that live data collection. And to the person who asked, if I may, about coming in late and not being able to access and get some information data collection done, always think about a phase 2 of your project. Maybe it's a second case study as an add-on when something becomes more mature and ready for evaluation or available data. And I would also say on that one, it can be a useful learning experience to identifying data gaps. And then you have a hook to talk about perhaps areas to build on, additional funding and growth, or just recognizing limitations and expectations. And that is a story in itself. And that's a finding to me. And it's where you want to be more intelligent down the road. Well, we couldn't answer it this time, but here's how we're going to build our monitoring and reporting to be able to do so in the future. So it's more of an opportunity than a real gap in my mind. And it's part of the truthful, unvarnished story, as I'm saying. It's like, we can't answer this question, but we're going to try to do it in the future.
Excellent, David. Yeah, go ahead, Nabiha.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think since we embarked on this process, we realized our own internal data is something we could be using much more, but we need to get a better handle on it. We need to make sure we're entering our data consistently enough that we can get it out in a useful way. So we've found that almost a parallel process here is working to develop our internal data to fill in gaps and to learn how to use it, because I think that we have potential that we're not yet using.
Great, Nabiha. Yeah, one of the principles of community-based evaluation is that you start with what data you have. Look around in your drawers and your file folders, wherever you have, look with what you have. Start. Don't reinvent the data collection wheel. And then you go collect your own data for the gaps, to fill the gaps. And David, the next question I think has you written all over it. You talked about pushing beyond outputs to outcomes, and so there's a question about how do you do that? Are there existing templates to keep track of outputs and activities?
Sure. Let me start, and colleagues, please help me out too. Definitely, that's where we want to be, as we talked about as a group, is understanding those outcomes. So I'll harken back to the IRCC logic models, resettlement, settlement, and every program we have one, much like some organizations do. Great starting point, documents we can share, and it gives you a bit of a guide, understand it. I'll offer you folks a couple of quick thoughts on this one. Is, activities are what we do, outputs are what we produce, quickly speaking, and then outcomes at different levels are what we're trying to achieve. So think about it in that way. Ask yourself the why question. Why are we doing this? What change am I trying to affect with my intervention or my pilot or my program? What client behavior am I trying to influence? What information or awareness are we trying to build among our population that we serve? So kind of why questions, and those are essentially getting into an outcome space. Think about change state, and a more ideal expected result, where we want to be, not just reporting back on what we did, I think. And that's kind of a very quick and dirty way to move us past counting things to understanding why and what kind of change are we influencing or working on together. And just a starting point. It's just a quick reflection for you, but it doesn't have to be that complicated. And there's lots of literature out there talking about these differences in causal chains and results logic models, but really moving us to impacts and those why questions. And then how do we do against those expectations we've set for ourselves?
Excellent, David. Leah and Nabiha, do you want to jump in on that? No? Good. So we still got a minute or so left and a couple of questions. Somebody asked about the CCBR evaluation tool. So I'm just sending you the link to our collective. It's not just CCBR. David, Nabiha, and Leah were all on the National Advisory Committee for the Eval for Refugee project, and you have the link there with the resources. Let's try this question, and it's has IRCC written in it. Why IRCC, part of the iCare program, does not provide reports of services outcomes based on the logic model?
I like that question, and I do love iCare, by the way, folks. My evaluation team and I use it quite frequently. It is one of our primary data sources. I am not responsible for the iCare system. Let me just state that up front. So reporting falls to another group. So I will pass this message on. I know the reporting is somewhat limited at what service providers get, and you get these canned PDFs. And I understand that, and we're working to change that, I can tell you. Our Chief Data Officer branch is looking at more dynamic reporting for the service providers. I think it's kind of growth stages of reporting with iCare, frankly. The system is 4 years old, really, 5 maybe, in terms of full maturity. So what can we produce? We start with a bit of an output approach, quick reports that we can push out, but then structuring it along service lines or outcome logic models takes a little more work, and we're not quite there yet. But I love that approach, and I think it can be done, and we're working towards that. It also is the responsibility of the evaluation groups or the settlement program folks to take iCare data and map it against the outcomes and start to produce things based on that in analysis. So work in progress. We definitely agree with what you're saying, and I think you'll see more from us in that regard in the coming year or so.
Great, David. And there's one last question as we wrap this up, and maybe I'll just field that out if that's okay with the rest of you. It's around whether you should do a process or an outcome evaluation if you have limited resources. And my response would be to do both, and rather than choose between process and outcome, just scope down your evaluation to a smaller level. Maybe have fewer methods or shorter timeline. It used to be in the field of evaluation, we started off with outcome evaluation. That was the focus. A pendulum swung and we did process evaluation. Now a lot of evaluations are both process and outcome, because that's the theory of change, right? Is what do you do? That's activities, process, and to what end? What are the expected results or outcomes, and what's the link between those two? So that's more common is to combine them, even though there are circumstances where you can distill them and keep them separate.
What Leah said about understanding those key questions you want to assess and sort of measure is a great starting point. And don't worry about labels, as Rich said. I would say too, like back in the day, Treasury Board here, federal government called them formative and summative evaluations. They put all sorts of labels on it. It's really, what are those results questions you want to know about at whatever level that are meaningful to you to make changes in your organization or improvements? And I think that's a nice starting point, regardless of what level it's at.
And that's maybe a good way to end, because David used the word meaningful, and that was the focus of this workshop, making evaluation meaningful for you as service provider organizations, including in times of, and maybe especially in times of disruption. So we want to thank you all. I want to thank the other panelists for their contribution. Each of your unique perspectives on this topic was really valuable. And thanks to P2P for keeping the conversation going. Obviously successful because there's so many workshops that are spinning off of their conferences. So great job to P2P and Sonali for helping organize this event. So I think we'll sign off now and wish you all a good day.